Hello friends, today in this lecture we will start with the first key concepts in our course, that is liberty. And on liberty we are going to have 3 lectures through which we will discuss different aspects of these terms, and this is one of the most essentially contested concepts in political theory, which has different connotations, different conceptualization, and there are different strands of political discourse and debates on this question of liberty. So, what we are going to discuss is to start with definition of liberty and try to understand with some of the political thinkers and their ideas about their conception of liberty, and then we will move on to the republican notion of liberty, and also the negative and positive conception of liberty as argued by Isaiah Berlin and certain responses to that kind of conceptualization. And we will also discuss then free speech and hate speech, what is freedom of speech and expression, and what can be the reasonable limits or restriction to the freedom of speech and expression. And finally, we will also discuss the idea of freedom as moral autonomy, or what Gandhi calls freedom as Swaraj. So, these are some of the key themes through which we will try to understand liberty and its different conceptualization. In today's lecture, we are going to focus mainly on the understanding of liberty or freedom through some of the key thinkers, and then we will focus more on the republican conception of liberty. As a way of introduction, many of us are aware how liberty, or what we call freedom, is regarded essential or a precondition for any meaningful life or any dignified life, both for the individual and community to be possible. So, we will find in our political discourse, in our political debates, or in our history books, the struggle for freedom, and freedom is regarded as the prerequisite, the first condition for any other goods to happen for individual or for the community. So, then the significance of this concept also leads to some of the other challenging aspect that is attached to this question of freedom. And what are those challenges that we are going to discuss over the course of 3 lectures, but we need to keep in mind that liberty in its absolute sense, that means if it is understood as freedom from restraints, it cannot be absolute freedom from all kinds of restraints. So, it is not possible to realize freedom in that sense as understood by freedom of all kind of restraints. So, then what should be the possible limits, and who is going to decide what should be the possible limits or restriction to the liberty and freedom? These are some of the philosophical moral questions that we are going to discuss with this topic. And the other aspect of this theme is this idea of freedom of speech and expression, and when and how this freedom of speech and expression can possibly lead to undesirable ends, and how to restrict that, and which authority under which rule can reasonably restrict such freedom of speech and expressions. In other words, how it can turn in prevent it from turning free speech to hate speech and so on. So, these are some of the crucial aspect of this theme, liberty. So, the concept of liberty signifies a notion of choice and absence of any constant. So, the basic understanding of liberty or freedom is about choice. So, individual and community has choice to make decisions, and in making such decisions they are not constrained by any authority or any force that is external to them. So, in a sense the liberty or freedom is about autonomy of individual or community from any kind of restrictions while they are making decisions or while they are deciding about their choice, and they want to pursue that choice or that decision for whatever their conception of good life or proper life are. So, the concept of liberty then signifies a notion of choice both for individual and community, and also an absence of any restraints, that is external or state interference in exercising one's choice in order to lead a good life. So, you remember in political discourse you often find institutions of a state or its ideologues arguing about the good life, and to lead that good life they prescribe certain course of action, certain decisions, certain policies to be followed by the people. Now, that conception of good life as designed by the state and its authority is inherently inimical to the free progress or to make the condition for living a dignified life or a free life for individual or society. So, the danger of a state or its institution designing a conception of good life for the individual and then certain policies to be followed by them is essentially problematic, because it restricts the individual liberty to make decisions, to have certain choices and to pursue the life which he or she want to pursue. It means notion of choice which is absence of any kind of constraints that be external. That means it can be a group or other individual or community on the one hand, or the state and its institution on the other, in exercising his or her own choice. So, that is a very basic fundamental understanding of liberty and freedom. So, it emphasizes on the curtailment of restrictions or impediments if individuals or human beings are to lead a meaningful and purposeful life. So, the basic contentious understanding of liberty lies here about the meaningful and purposeful life. Who is in control of what is meaningful or what is purposeful life? Is it the individual and community themselves who decides about what is meaningful life or what is purposeful life, or it is the state or the external authority and institutions which decide for them what is good for them and what is purposeful for them? So, in that sense, when state and its institutions or certain moral ideologues dictates what is good life, what is purposeful life, then it curtails or restricts individual or community freedom or liberty to make decisions and make choices, or that is always dangerous, and how that can be dangerous we will discuss later. So, basically liberty is about maximizing the scope for individuals to make decisions. In other words, limiting the restrictions or impediments on individual choice or individual decisions to make certain decisions and choice about their life or about their conception of good life and so on. So, it is in other words opposite of subjugation, coercion, control and domination of one by the another. So, liberty can be understood in this sense as well, which is one as I have discussed about choice or freedom from external restrictions. On the other hand, we can also understand freedom or liberty as absence of subjugation, coercion, control and domination of one by the other. So, in the context of India, we have had the experience of colonialism, where the nation was ruled by a foreign country, and we were subjugated to their dictates and their conception of public life or what they consider as rule or principle of governance and so on. in that condition we were fighting for the freedom from the British rule. So it has the collective aspect to it also. It has the individual aspect attached to it also, where as we will discuss it in details when we will discuss Gandhian conception of Swaraj and Swaraj as freedom, which includes both the individual and the collective. Now, in other words, we can understand freedom and liberty as an absence or opposite of subjugation, coercion, control and domination, and it is desirable for the progress of both individuals and community. So, the decision or the ability to make choice that concerns one life is necessary for the progress of not just individual but also for the community or the collectivities. However, this concept of liberty runs into a problem, and there are many contestations over its meaning in a society where individuals to individuals, groups to groups, individual to groups or vice versa, ideas, opinions and beliefs differ. Now, in a society when different peoples, different groups, different communities have different beliefs, different opinions, different ideas, different faiths, now how to reconcile their differences, and these differences are often conflicting, opposite to each other. Now, in that kind of situation, to ensure the equal space for all the groups, all the individuals to pursue what they think are good for them is something which requires some moral consideration, some philosophical reflection, and that we are going to discuss. So, the idea of liberty or freedom as opposite to subjugation, coercion, control and domination of one over the other is easily said, but in practice it runs into many problems, many contestations, especially when there is a society where many individuals or groups or individual and groups or groups with other groups vary from each other, differ from each other about their beliefs, faith, ideas and opinions. Now, how to reconcile such differences which is often contradictory and conflicting. Now, this kind of contestations is also there when individual interacts with the state or vice versa. What are the fundamental rights, what are the inalienable rights, where are the limits against the state and where they cannot interfere into certain matters concerning the individual, or it is about relationship between groups or communities and the state or vice versa, or individual and community or individual again. So, in this kind of interrelationships between individual, group and state, there is a kind of contestations in meaning, in conceptualization about what could be the reasonable restrictions that can be put for individual liberty or freedom. So, what are these reasonable constraints or restrictions may vary therefore from society to society, from context to context, depending upon the different consideration, and what are those considerations that we will discuss, especially when we will discuss John Stuart Mills. So, liberal emphasize on the need of liberty and freedom. So, for as we have discussed in our introductory lectures, the liberalism and its emphasis on the individual and the whole political and public institutions or structure is to ensure that the individual have enough scope to develop his or her own personality. So, for them the liberty and freedom is absolute prerequisite for a prosperous or free society. So, for them liberty and freedom is absolutely necessary. So, the classical liberals describe liberty as natural rights or inalienable rights. So, individual has certain liberties or freedom which is inalienable. So, the whole discourse of rights, natural rights, fundamental rights and so legal rights and so on, is based on this idea of certain natural rights to individual, which is there in the classical liberal philosophy. So, liberty thus for them is about freedom of choice or freedom from restraints. Now, what are these freedom and what could be the reasonable restrictions are subject to debate, and different liberal philosophers have different understanding of such reasonable restrictions, but nonetheless their conceptualization of liberty is freedom of choice or freedom from restraints. It may vary from individual to individual thinkers even among the liberalism, but necessarily the conceptualization require a kind of freedom of choice or to freedom to make decisions or freedom from any external restraints. So, modern liberals describe liberty as the condition essential for developing individuals' own skill and talents to develop a personality of their own. So, the idea of individuality or one's own self and one's own judgment requires certain preconditions for human beings to develop such individuality, to develop some judgment which he or she can call his or her own. Now, that requires a precondition which is liberty. Liberty and freedom provides the individual a scope to develop his or her personality, to develop his or her choice, opinion, judgment and so on, and that requires any complete freedom from any kind of external restraints. Now, these two terms is also necessary to understand, which we often use interchangeably, that is freedom and liberty. So, although it is used interchangeably, however, these two terms analytically differ from each other. So, liberty can be understood as a negative term and is more about the autonomy of the individual from interference of a group or community. So, it is about isolating the individual or separating the individual from the groups or from the community, and then conceptualizing his or her freedom in a complete autonomous or in a sense of his isolated existence from the larger self, larger society and community. So, it is more a kind of negative term, whereas freedom is understood as a positive term that is more about being or participating in the community. So, we will discuss this point when we will discuss again the Republican conception of liberty, where liberty is not just having freedom and autonomy from the community and living one's life the way one want to live, but liberty, or as it is understood as a positive form in a sense of freedom, is more about being and participating in the larger self, or being or participating in the community life. In the actual realization of liberty, it is not possible to enjoy or exercise liberty by keeping oneself aloof and indifferent from the larger public life. It is only through participating or acting in the public collective life we realize our freedom. So, it is more a kind of positive terms, and argue about the participation, being or engagement in the public life, and in being, participating and in the engagement we actually realize our freedom and not the other way around. So, liberty is understood as absolute autonomy or freedom from all constraints. It is an ideal then. So, one cannot really achieve it or realize it in its absolute sense on earth, although we can aspire for liberty as understood as complete freedom or freedom from all kind of external restraints, but it is not possible, it is not pragmatic to have an individual which can enjoy such existence, because one of the fundamental characteristic of individual is that he or she requires associational life. Associational lives requires the existence of other, and therefore when the other self interacts with others, what could be the space where the self is free, and what could be the scope where there can be minimal or reasonable restrictions on the freedom of the self. So, these are some of the contentious questions that we need to discuss. So, liberty in that sense understood as absolute freedom is impossible to have in a form of associational life on earth. So, what we are left with is freedom, and this freedom is understood as liberty under the constraints of law. So, the rule of law restricts or pose certain restrictions and limits to individual choice, individual movements, individual decisions and so on. Whether that rule of law is justifiable or not, and how far that rule of law is justifiable or not can be, should we have the rule of law or any restrictions or not. These are some of the consideration when we think about liberty, which is understood as freedom within the constraints of law. So, here the law enables the individual to develop himself or herself into the personality or individuality that he or she aspires to. Philosophers like Hannah Arendt makes a conceptual difference between these two concepts. So, for her, liberty is a negative concept, whereas freedom entails participation in public affairs. So, this participation is necessary to realize one's freedom and not kind of isolation or autonomous life from disconnected from the larger community life. So, according to her, freedom is not merely about absence of restraints, right, and that has different consequences. So, in the popular general sense of the term, if liberty is understood as, it is my business, there is no one else who should interfere with what I think is good or not. So, it has many other moral implications which we will discuss later on. So, for Hannah Arendt here, the freedom is about participation and not just about freedom from restraints. So, in actually participating, one realizes one's freedom. So, one's ability and willingness to participate in the public life and constitute the republic. So, this participation and constitution of a republic or collective life is something which provides the condition in the first place to realize oneself, to make certain decisions which concerns one life and so on. If that participation or acting in the public life is absent, then there will be no republic, no collective self which provide the condition in the first place for the individual to realize his or her own self, to make decisions about his or her own life and so on. So, to create that conditions, it is absolutely necessary to actually participate and engage in the public life to construct a society or a republic which will enable or provide the condition for the individuals to make certain decisions which concerns their life and so on. So, thus she emphasized upon the actual realization of freedom through one's public activities and not by living a isolatory, autonomous, individualistic life. So, however, for our purposes, we will use these two terms, liberty and freedom, interchangeably, as we will see later that these aspects of negative or positive conception of liberty and freedom are well conceptualized when we will discuss about republican or liberal and positive and negative conception of liberty. Conceptualization of liberty is put forward by several political thinkers as one of the significant concepts to ensure human progress, to maintain the free nature or soul of human being without subjugations or oppression. So, all the political thinkers, although they differ in their conceptualization of the term, agree to the significance of this concept as necessary for human progress or to maintain the free nature or free will of individual soul from any subjugation or oppressions. So, many political thinkers like Hobbes, John Locke, Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, Isaiah Berlin, Rawls and Karl Marx have put forward different and interesting conceptualization of liberty, which we will discuss over the course of 3 lectures, as I have told you before. So, there are multiple strands of understanding and conceptualization of the notion of liberty and freedom. So, in the first part of this lecture today on liberty, we will focus on the meanings of liberty or freedom through the ideas of political thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, Mill and Karl Marx, and in the second part of this lecture we will focus on the republicanism or the republican notion of freedom, its classical and contemporary conceptualization and its relevance in the contemporary times. So, if you look at the John Locke theory of liberty, he was arguing about liberty as necessary for the growth of individuality, and this liberty is something which he regarded as existing in the state of nature. So, if you are familiar with this social contract tradition of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, they argue about the state of nature and how from the state of nature states come into existence and why individuals should obey the state and what are the rights which state must protect, and if it does not protect, what are the alternatives or what are the choices that individuals or society may have in that condition. So, in that social contract traditions, Locke argue that the individual has certain rights which precedes the civil and political society that he constituted for the collective life or for the political life. These rights are liberty, property. So, along with liberty, he equally considered life and property. So, liberty, right to life, liberty and property is something which he regarded as inalienable rights of the individual, which existed in the state of nature as well. So, the responsibility or the duty of a state is to protect or ensure the individual right to life, liberty and property. So, his justification or conceptualization of liberty is based on the notion of morality, and it is grounded on the laws of nature and notion of equality. So, he argued that liberty is a natural right and is therefore universal. So, no individual should harm any other individual, and he talked about protection of life, liberty and property as necessary prerequisite for the individual to develop in the true sense of the term or to makes one individuality his own. So, that distinctive nature of individual life or individual conception of good life is possible when a state protects or ensures certain rights. These are right to life, liberty and property. So, he emphasized on the absence of constraints to attain liberty, and he pointed out liberty is meant for all and not just for few. So, these are certain rights which is equally available for every single individual or citizen in the state, and all the individual then must respect each other's right to life, liberty and property, and the state is there to ensure that these rights are not interfered with. So, for him right to liberty needs to be secured along with right to life and property, and he pointed out that liberty precedes both the emergence of political and civil society, as I have explained to you. Now, the next thinker that we will discuss is Rousseau and his conception of liberty, which is in contrast to Lockean understanding of liberty. So, Rousseau considered liberty, here it is more about the individual, but in Rousseau conceptualization, liberty is regarded as collective goal of individual to be realized in a society. So, his concept of liberty is individualistic in nature, but it is based on the collective good or larger good of human beings as a whole, what is also termed as general will. Now, this general will is the will of individual and collective at the same time. Now, we will not go into the complexities of this concept of general will, but in Rousseau understanding of liberty, the individual freedom can be realized in association with the larger collective good of the society. So, he pointed out that liberty can be achieved by abandoning one's selfish interest, desires and motives, and these are the reasons why the society is not equal, or why there is no freedom in the society, I mean civil society or the society that is constituted after the state of nature, because the individuals are guided by their selfish interest, desires and motives that restricts the freedom, that creates inequality in society. So, for him the freedom of individual is in accordance with the freedom of the society or the collective as well. So, for him liberty in the very individualistic sense enables individuals to create an unjust and unequal society. So, for Rousseau, liberty is freedom or liberation from a state of unfreedom as it emerges in the civil and political society. So, he believed that people are liberated only through obedience of law, or what he calls general will. So, an individual can be a free individual only by becoming an integral part of the collective group or the society or the community, and not by living a life which is independent and autonomous from the collective or community life. So, to quote Rousseau, he said, "A free people obeys, but it does not serve. It has leaders, but no masters. It obeys the laws, but it obeys only the laws, and it is due to the strength of laws that is not forced to obey." So, for him in this conceptualization, individual is free only when he or she is free from personal servitudes. That means he governed his or her life according to the law, or what he called general will, but that general will is not a kind of dictates or a kind of law which put him in the condition of servitude or so on. So, his understanding of liberty can be traced back to one of his popular phrase, which many of us are aware of, which is there in the social contract, where he states that man is born free, but everywhere he is in the chains. So, the political society or the civil society that gets constituted after the state of nature create the conditions of unfreedom. Now, how to ensure freedom for each and everyone in these conditions of unfreedom is what he argues about general will, where the will is free from individual interests, motives or selfish objectives, and the objective of the group or the individual is in accordance with the larger good of the society and so on. So, in this conceptualization, then he goes on to the extent of forcing the individual, and there lies the danger in Rousseau conception of freedom, where he argues that even the few person's will, if it is in the larger interest of the society, can be considered as the general will. And there is always the danger that the authoritarian or the dictatorial regime may use these approach to force their conception of good life to force what they think is good for the society to the rest of the society. So, he argues that the general will ensure the freedom for each and everyone, and others who do not obey the general will can be forced to be free. Now, this kind of conceptualization makes the understanding of liberty problematic, and as I have explained that many dictatorial or authoritarian regime or groups can use this approach to justify their interference or restrictions on the freedom of others and so on. Now, the next thinker that we will discuss is John Stuart Mill, and Mill is perhaps one of the finest supporter of individual conception of liberty. So, in his essay on liberty, Mill talked about the protection of individual liberty from state interference and other kinds of social interference. So, his understanding of liberty is grounded on the lifelong interests of men, and he emphasized on the importance and significance of individuality to cultivate the proper self of human beings. So, the individuality, the personality, the individual judgment and opinion is something which is possible to achieve only when the individuals have the liberty or freedom from external restraints, be it state or society or the other individuals and groups. So, he said that no individual opinion should be suppressed by the collective or majority decisions. Now, sometimes it happens in the public discourse or the political discourse, some kind of voices can be regarded as undesirable or illegitimate or the hate speech or untruth or so on. Against those kind of consideration, Mills argue that no opinion should be suppressed, or especially if it is the minority's opinion, because for him the society can prosper together when all the opinions are allowed to be expressed freely without any kind of constraints. And what are the possible benefits of such opinions, that we will discuss when we will discuss again this idea of freedom of speech and expression or free speech and hate speech. But here it is perhaps good to note that freedom and liberty is something which ensures all kind of opinions to be expressed freely without any restrictions, and that will ultimately create a society which will be more prosperous and more free. So, for him liberty is then an end in itself. So, liberty is not justified because it creates conditions for other goods to be achieved. For Mill, liberty is an end in itself. So, he pointed out that only free actions or freely chosen actions performed by an individual can make him or her a free person in real sense. So, he focused on the rights to free expressions, thought and freedom of speech, principle of individuality, and limits to authority and authoritarian nature of power in the state. So, there are many dangers to the individual's freedom and liberty, and those restrictions are often against the interest of the individual's pursuit of what he or she considers good life. What is his or her conceptualization of good life? Now, Mills also argue about, and that we will discuss, how a state can reasonably put certain restrictions to individual actions, but for him the opinion, the speech and expressions, the freedom of thought is something which we all must regard as desirable, or we must respect, even if it is contrary or opposite to our own opinion or ideas. So, he pointed out there should be minimum restrictions on individual liberty only when it has potential to harms other. Otherwise, the individual should have the maximum freedom to lead one's life. So, the only in his words, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harms to others. So, this is the only possible criteria for posing any restrictions and limit to individual freedom and liberty. Now, he also makes a crucial distinctions between what he calls self-regarding functions and other regarding functions. Of course, in actual pragmatic practical life, it is often very difficult to maintain a distinction between self-regarding function or others regarding function, but we can conceptually understand it, those actions which is related to individuals or which has implications to individual life is self-regarding function. So, what I wear, what I eat, where I go for education, what profession I choose are some of the things which concerns individual or myself. Now, in these decisions, in these actions, there should not be any limitations at all. Whereas, the others regarding functions are those actions of individuals which can have potential, which have implications on others and which can potentially harms other. So, like smoking in the public space or drugs or so on, which can have, or listening to loud music which can possibly interfere with the others right to have leisure life without any interference, to listen to their choice of music and so on. So, in the others regarding functions there can be certain reasonable restrictions posed by the state. So, these are only some of the limitations that he argued about. So, in John Stuart Mill we will come to his ideas when we will discuss again, but here the argument is about the absolute freedom of individual to lead his or her life according to his or her own personality without any constraints. Only some reasonable constraints can be put when those actions are potentially harmful for the others. Now, the Karl Marx and his conception of liberty is basically about his idea of alienation, where the freedom that is available for the majority of people in capitalist free society is not really available for the majority of individual. So, he argued that the inability to express oneself expresses unfreedom or curtailment of freedom. So, he put forward 4 stages to explain denial of liberty or freedom to majority of individuals in a society. So, where the agent, for which he refers to the laborers or the workers, is alienated from the products, his or she is alienated from his own productive activities, from his own nature or individual, and from other human beings. In this way, the individuals in this society lives in alienated life, and this alienated life do not allow him the conditions or ability to express himself, because he lives a kind of disconnected life from his own labor, from his own activities, from his own self and from the other selves. So, in this kind of society, one cannot really talks about freedom as self expression and so on. So, his understanding of liberty thus focuses on the inability of self expressions of workers or laborers under capitalism or capitalist modes of production, where the socio-economic conditions for the large number of masses or socio-economic unconditions, which is a kind of unfreedom for them, make a mockery of legal and political freedom promised in a free market capitalist society. So, for them this liberal political or legal freedom is hollow in the absence of social and economic conditions of freedom. So, thus from these above thinkers and their conceptualization of freedom, what we get is that for all of them liberty is significant for the development of human beings and to lead a progressive and free life without external restrictions and constraints. They also talked about the free choice and decision making and participation of individual or people in the collective life, like in choosing and electing government and so on. So, liberals like John Locke had an individualistic idea of liberty free from any kind of interferences and argued about limited or minimal role of government or the state, whereas Karl Marx or Rousseau had argued about the exercise of liberty or freedom in a collective manner by living in a community devoid of selfish interest. So, the realization of liberty or freedom for Marx and Rousseau is about living in a community devoid of one's own selfish interest and so on. So, now if we look at the Republican conception of freedom, so the term republicanism refers to a particular kind of liberty or freedom. So, a distinction can be made between Republican conception of freedom or the way we generally conceptualize freedom in our ordinary discourse. So, in ordinary sense of liberty describes liberty as freedom from constraints or from state interference. So, in this sense liberty demands non-interference. This you can also understand as the liberal conception of liberty, which is about freedom from restraints, freedom from interference of the state and all. Now, in the republicanism is grounded on the value of political liberty and it specifically emphasizes on liberty as non-domination and not freedom of restraints. Now, how to ensure this non-domination from any kind of abusive, authoritarian or arbitrary power is by acting upon to creating a public or a republic based on civic virtue or associational life. So, in this understanding liberty or freedom is rooted in the idea of political liberty as non-domination. This idea of liberty is thus different from the liberty as non-interference as argued by many liberal thinkers like Mill, Locke, as we have discussed. Republicanism explains political liberty that specifically focuses on structural independence or the role of institutions which provide the condition for individual to exercise his or her freedom. So, that is the condition of not being forcibly subjected to any authoritarian, unlawful and arbitrary forms of power. So, Pettit, one of the Republican scholars or thinker, writes that a person or group enjoys freedom to the extent that no other person or groups has the capacity to interfere in their affairs on an arbitrary basis. Now, there is a slight difference in the conceptualization of liberty as freedom from restraints or liberty and freedom as freedom from non-domination. Now, to ensure freedom from non-domination, it requires certain participation, certain engagement on the parts of individual with the in the larger collective public life, whereas freedom of restraints have a conceptualization where individual is seen as free and autonomous from the larger collective life, and the larger collective life should not interfere with the matters that is related to individual. So, some of the Republican thinkers are Skinner, Weierle, Manner, Laborde, Costa, Hanuhan and Taylor and so on. Now, we will discuss some of their thoughts. In the classical republicanism, it is understood through the writings of thinkers like Machiavelli, Milton, Harrington, Montesquieu, Blackstone, Jefferson, Madison and Adam Smith and many others. Now, they all emphasized on some of the significant political values such as the importance and need of civic virtue in society, that is community feeling or consciousness, active political participation to expose corruption and remove its negative consequences on the larger political life, the need of a constitution and rule of law. These are some of the necessary prerequisites for them to realize freedom, to enable the individual to realize his or her freedom is something which requires a public or a republic which is based on civic virtue, which is based on individual participation in the collective life. So, it can be argued that the republican thinkers did not ask for a limited or minimum role of the state as we find in the many liberal thinkers, but their vision was of a state where the values of political liberty and civic virtue could be maintained. So, for them a constitutional government would perhaps govern citizens democratically and provide them with security, rights, freedom and justice to live a content life. So, instead of arguing for a minimalist state or looking at the state as a necessary evil, republican thinkers and scholars argued for a state which will be based on the idea of political liberty or civic virtue, which will create the conditions for the individual to live or lead his or her life in a dignified manner, in a content manner and so on. So, they believe that the republican liberty is largely possible or it can be realized in a community life where individuals or human beings together can learn to contribute in their own ways to make their life worthy of living together in a society. So, in this conception of liberty and freedom, it is not about individual living his life independently of the collective life. It is coming together of individual to create a public, to create a republic which will ensure the liberty or freedom for everyone, which will fight certain evils in the public lives like corruption and so on. So, freedom for them is then not just about enjoying the way one likes to live one's life, but about participation in the public life, to contributing in the public life to make it more democratic, to make it more egalitarian, to make it possible from arbitrary rule of the authoritarian or the dictatorial regime. So, the classical republicans and republicanism finds its relevance in the Aristotelian idea of a Greek polis, which also retained the vision of constructing a good life of people in a polis that is possible through active public participation and civic virtue. So, the famous definition of citizenship in Aristotle is one's ability to govern and ability to rule and be ruled in turn. So, every single individual is capable of ruling the rest, and similarly he is also ruled by the rest. So, in other words, this conception of liberty or good life is through participation in the public life, and only through the participation in the public life one can truly enjoy his or her freedom. So, the classical republican believe not all laws therefore are arbitrary to the freedom or liberty. So, law provide the condition for the individual to realize his or her freedom, is in contrast to the liberal conception of freedom, which regard the laws, state and its institution as necessary evil, as some kind of restriction, and which should be made reasonable and so on. Here in the republican conception we see the idea of liberty which is facilitated by the rule of law, and individuals themselves participate in active manner to constitute what is rule of law, to constitute what is republic and so on. So, now the contemporary republicanism, they believed in the civic humanist interpretation of the classical republicanism, that is to focus on cultivating civic virtue and this is something which is missing in our contemporary political discourse as well, where we fight for the rights which is self regarding. That means we are bothered only about those rights which concerns me and not as a collective, as a whole, and that creates a kind of discontent or disconnect between individual liberty or the liberty of the society or the larger selfhood as well. So, the realization of freedom and liberty requires individual to cultivate certain civic virtue, as we have discussed in Hannah Arendt and many other thinkers also. So, it focuses on the reinterpretation of the classical republicanism and focuses on the cultivating civic virtue to remove some of the social evils like corruptions and provide conditions for individual progress. So, some of the contemporary republicans are Arendt, Skinner, Pettit and many others. So, the contemporary republicans have argued that public participation and civic virtue, that is community feeling and consciousness, could be important tools or means for securing and preserving political liberty and to fight any arbitrary rule or coercive power. So, this public participations and civic virtue is necessary for any kind of freedom or political freedom to be enjoyed or to fight the corruption or the arbitrary coercive rule in any society. So, the contemporary republicans broadly emphasize on promoting freedom or independence from any kind of arbitrary, coercive or authoritarian rule. So, they fear that autocratic or dictatorial government could pose a threat or challenge to the very idea of political liberty that is essential for individual growth. So, if we understand liberal conception of liberty as freedom from restraint, and individuals should be concerned or guided by his or her own selfish interest or motives, and if they do not contribute or engage in the collective life or in the making of the collective life, then the chances are the collective life will be governed or ruled by the undemocratic or dictatorial or authoritarian ruler, which can pose a threat to the very condition of liberty or freedom, which is so essential for the individual to progress. So, they argued that if there are no criminal or civil laws, then citizens would have no idea of what freedom is or what free interrelationships mean between or among the individuals. So, the idea of rule of law or what is civil law or criminal law give the individual a sense of what is freedom or what does it mean to relate with others or other groups and so on. Now, in this absence of rule of law, the coercive or the arbitrary ruler can forcibly curtail their freedoms. Hence, to make republican freedom exist and to be enjoyed and cherished by all, it is necessary to have a legal system or rule of law. As Hayek argued that law is not invasive of liberty, but its necessary precondition. So, for them the laws and rule of law is not a kind of infringement or invasion of individual liberty or freedom, but is a prerequisite for any liberty to be enjoyed or protected or to be cherished by others. So, the focus of republicanism is on political institutions. So, for them political institution is something which provide the enabling condition for the freedom or liberty to be enjoyed. So, they believes that public political institutions are essential for the protection of individual freedom. So, they argued about the proliferation of democracy through its various institutions like legislature, courts, rule of law, ideas of federalism, constitution and so on. So, for them these institutions provide the conditions for the individual to protect, to make sense of his or her liberty and actively participate in the public life, and these institutions also then work as a check and balances to the excessive centralization of power or to the arbitrary use of the power by the authoritarian or corrupt rule and so on. So, the objective or goal for the republicanism is to sustain and enhance democracy and democratic ideals, ethos and values, to build a right, bond or obliged society and a free society that respects the true value of freedom without domination of arbitrary power and subjugation. So, they wanted individual to value their worth as citizens and to contest or participate in public activities such as election, to commit themselves to right to vote and to choose their own representatives and to remind them of their duties. So, the condition of freedom that we have is dependent on the participation that we have in our public life. So, to demand freedom, to demand liberty without engaging in the public life is something which is problematic, which creates problem or tensions in the society. So, they emphasized upon the role and functions of political institutions to curtail and restrict the excessive and arbitrary powers of the state executive. Instead of having a coercive centralized form of government, the republicanism or republicans argue about the federalism and a decentralized government. So, what are the relevance of republicanism? They broadly contest the power relations of domination and subjugation to exercise freedom. So, freedom is freedom from domination. To ensure freedom of domination, it requires public participation, public engagement to create a public, to create the political institutions which will ensure or which will create the condition for the individual to exercise his or her freedom. So, it broadly contests the power relation of domination and subjugation to exercise freedom of liberty and make sense of liberty as non-domination in contrast to freedom as freedom from restriction. It is in contrast to the idea of minimalist state and emphasize on democracy, democratic ideals and values which are essential for the protection of rights, freedom, justice of people from the arbitrary rule. So, they focus on the value of civic virtue in order to fight social evils like corruption and to check selfish interests and arbitrary exercise of power by the authorities. It argues for political liberty, rule of law and public participation to create the conditions necessary for the realization of true freedom. So, the republican conceptualization of freedom and liberty then is about creating the condition which requires the participation of every individual in the public collective life. So, this is all for today's lecture. In the next lecture, we are going to discuss negative and positive conception of liberty and also free speech and hate speech and so on. So, for this lecture, you can refer to some of these books like Norman Berry, An Introduction to Modern Political Theory. From Bhargav and Acharya, you can read a chapter on liberty, and similarly Hoffman, Introduction to Political Theory, you can look at the chapter on liberty. Similarly, from the Issue and Political Theory, and to know more about the conception of republicanism, you can look at this entry on republicanism in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So, these are some of the texts which you can refer to. In the next lecture, I will be giving you some more readings on this concept of liberty. So, thank you for listening. Thank you all.